He was within sight of home, so close he could see smoke rising from his own hearth fires, could nearly make out individual figures moving on the shore. After 10 years of war and 9 days of perfect sailing, Odysseus stood at the prow of his ship, looking at Ithaca for the first time in a decade. His wife was there, somewhere in that cluster of buildings. His son, now 10 years old, whom he had left as an infant. His father, his servants, his kingdom. Home, finally, impossibly, miraculously within reach. Then his men opened the bag. In seconds, the winds imprisoned inside. Every contrary wind, every storm, every gust that might blow them off course, exploded out in a howling fury. The ship spun, driven backward, away from Ithaca, back across the sea they had just crossed. Odysseus watched his home vanish behind him, stolen by his men's greed and distrust, snatched away when he was perhaps an hour from landing, from embracing Penelope, from ending a journey that should have taken 2 weeks, but had already lasted more than a decade. It would be another 10 years before he saw Ithaca again. 10 years of monsters and magic, of watching his companions die one by one, of losing everything except his stubborn refusal to give up. The journey from Troy to Ithaca should have been simple. A 2-week sail across familiar waters. Instead, it became the most famous voyage in Western literature. A 10-year odyssey through lands at the edge of the world, where the rules of reality bent and broke, where gods and monsters tested whether one man's cunning and endurance could overcome divine curses and impossible odds. This is not just a story about monsters and gods, though there are plenty of both. It is not simply an adventure tale, though adventures crowd every book of Homer's epic poem, like islands dotting an endless sea. The Odyssey, composed around the 8th century BCE, is fundamentally a story about nostos, the ancient Greek word for homecoming, for return, for that deep human longing to reach the place where you belong after years of displacement and wandering. Tonight, we follow Odysseus across that 10-year journey, from the shores of fallen Troy to the rocky coast of Ithaca. We will meet the gods who helped him and the gods who hunted him. We will encounter man-eating giants and enchantresses who turn men to swine, sirens whose songs promise knowledge at the price of death, and a 6-headed monster who devours sailors as they pass through her narrow strait. We will descend into the land of the dead and sail past the cattle of the sun. But before we embark on that journey, before we push our black-hulled ships into the surf and set course for unknown waters, we must understand the man whose story this is. Let the rhythm of waves and wind carry you forward as we trace the path of one man's impossible voyage home. The man of many turns. Who was Odysseus? Before Troy fell, before the wooden horse disgorged its cargo of hidden warriors, before the 10-year war that defined a generation of Greek heroes, Odysseus was already known for something the other warriors were not: his mind. While Achilles possessed unmatched prowess in battle, while Ajax wielded strength that seemed to rival the gods themselves, while Agamemnon commanded the respect due to the high king of all the Greeks, Odysseus brought something different to the siege of Troy. Meti, that uniquely Greek concept of cunning intelligence, of wisdom combined with craftiness, of the ability to think 3 moves ahead and turn disadvantage into opportunity through sheer mental agility. The Greeks had a word for him that captures this quality perfectly: polytropos. It appears in the very first line of the Odyssey, where Homer invokes the muse to sing of the man of many turns, the man of many ways. The word carries layers of meaning that no single English translation can capture fully. It speaks to Odysseus's cunning and adaptability, his ability to navigate not just physical spaces, but social situations, to speak persuasively, to disguise himself, to lie convincingly when truth would be dangerous, to recognize the moment when boldness is needed and the moment when patience will serve better. This was not the typical heroic profile in ancient Greek culture. The ideal hero, embodied most perfectly by Achilles, was supposed to be straightforward, honest to the point of bluntness, courageous in battle, and concerned above all with honor and glory. Achilles never pretended to be something he was not. He stated his intentions plainly, fought openly, and cared little for clever stratagems when the direct approach would serve. Odysseus was different. He preferred the indirect approach, the clever solution, the unexpected angle of attack. This made him invaluable to the Greek cause at Troy. But it also made him suspect in the eyes of those who valued straightforward martial valor. Above all else, the Romans, when they inherited Greek mythology centuries later, would actually cast Odysseus, whom they called Ulysses, as something of a villain, a deceiver whose cunning was not admirable, but contemptible. Roman writers like Virgil referred to him as cruel Odysseus and deceitful Odysseus, transforming the Greeks' cunning hero into a figure of treachery. But for the Greeks themselves, Odysseus's intelligence was his defining heroic quality. The goddess Athena herself, embodiment of wisdom and strategic thinking, acknowledged him as her favorite mortal, telling him in Book 13 of the Odyssey, "We're both old hands at the arts of intrigue. Here among mortal men, you're far the best at tactics, spinning yarns, and I am famous among the gods for wisdom, cunning wiles, too." His intelligence manifested in countless ways during the Trojan War, when the Greeks, frustrated after 9 years of siege warfare, were on the verge of abandoning the campaign. It was Odysseus who conceived the strategy that would finally breach Troy's walls, the Trojan horse. That massive wooden construction, hollow inside, filled with Greek warriors, and left as a supposed offering to the gods, while the Greek army pretended to sail away, was Odysseus's idea, his masterpiece of deception. The plan required patience, discipline, and the ability to think psychologically, to predict how the Trojans would react when they saw the abandoned Greek camp and the mysterious horse standing before their gates. Who was this man before war called him away? Odysseus was king of Ithaca, a rocky island in the Ionian Sea, off the western coast of mainland Greece. It was not a wealthy kingdom by the standards of the great powers, nothing like Agamemnon's Mycenae or Menelaus's Sparta. Ithaca was small, rugged, better suited to goats than to agriculture. Homer describes it through Odysseus's own words as a harsh land, but a good nurse of men. It was home. There he had married Penelope, daughter of Icarius, and descended from Spartan nobility, a woman whose intelligence would prove to match his own. By her he had a son, Telemachus, born just before the summons to war arrived. When messengers came to gather the Greek kings and heroes for the campaign to recover Helen from Troy, Odysseus had every reason to wish to stay home. He had a new wife, a newborn son, a kingdom to rule. According to some ancient traditions, though not explicitly stated in Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus even tried to avoid the call to war by feigning madness, plowing his fields with an ox and ass yoked together and sowing salt instead of seed. The story suggests that one of the recruiters, Palamedes, tested him by placing infant Telemachus in the plow's path, and Odysseus turned aside rather than harm his child, proving his sanity. Whether this account is historical or legendary embellishment by later writers remains debated among scholars, but it reflects the tradition that Odysseus was reluctant to leave his family. The war lasted 10 years. 10 years of blood and honor, of watching friends die, of seeing Troy's walls refuse to fall season after season. During those 10 years, Odysseus distinguished himself not primarily as a warrior in single combat, but as a counselor, diplomat, and strategist. When Troy finally fell, when his wooden horse had done its work and the city burned, and the 10-year war reached its bloody conclusion, Odysseus must have thought the hardest part was over. He had survived. He could go home now. The journey from Troy to Ithaca should have taken perhaps 2 weeks with favorable winds, a month at most if conditions were difficult. It took 10 years. First, landfall, the Cicone, and the lesson unlearned. The first stop after leaving Troy should have served as a warning about hubris and about listening to wise counsel. Homer's account in Book 9 tells us that Odysseus and his men made landfall at Ismarus, home of the Cicones, a people who had allied themselves with Troy during the war. For the Greeks, this made the Cicones legitimate targets. The 12 ships anchored offshore, and Odysseus led his men in a raid that was swift and devastating. They sacked the city, killing the men, enslaving the women, seizing wine and livestock and treasure. Homer explicitly records that Odysseus, after the successful raid, urged his men to leave immediately, to take their plunder, and return to the ships while their advantage held. But his men, triumphant and greedy, refused to listen. They wanted to celebrate their victory, feasting on the beach, building bonfires that could be seen for miles. The surviving Cicones did exactly what Odysseus had predicted. They sent messengers inland to their kinsmen, who arrived at dawn in overwhelming numbers. The battle that followed cost the Greeks dearly. Homer records the losses with devastating economy. 6 men from every ship. 72 men total. Out of roughly 600 who had left Troy, more than 1 in 10 dead, killed because they had ignored their leader's counsel. The survivors fled to their ships and rowed away, grieving their lost companions. It was an inauspicious start to the journey home, though the full implications would not become clear until much later. The pattern had been established. When Odysseus's men failed to exercise discipline or heed his warnings, disaster followed. The storm and the lotus eaters, forgetting the way home. After leaving Ismarus, Zeus sent a storm, whether as punishment or simply as the arbitrary cruelty that gods inflict on mortals, Homer does not specify. For 9 days the storm raged, pushing the 12 ships south and west, away from Greece, away from anything the men recognized. On the 10th day, the storm subsided, leaving them lost and exhausted. They found a coast and sent scouts to explore. This was the land of the Lotus Eaters, and according to Homer's account in Book 9, it presented a danger more insidious than violence. The inhabitants were gentle, peaceful people who offered hospitality by sharing their food, the lotus fruit. Homer describes its effect with devastating simplicity. Whoever ate of it lost the desire to return home, lost even the memory of home, lost all ambition for anything beyond the endless present of this place where life was easy. When the scouts did not return, Odysseus found them sitting with the lotus eaters, eating the fruit, unconcerned that their ships waited or that families awaited them in Ithaca. Homer tells us that Odysseus had to drag them back to the ships by force and bind them to the rowing benches to prevent their escape. He ordered the fleet to launch immediately before more men could taste the fruit. The lotus eaters present what many scholars interpret as a metaphor for the temptation to abandon difficult journeys in favor of comfortable forgetfulness. Whether Homer intended this as pure fantasy or as an encounter with a real plant with narcotic properties, some scholars have suggested various candidates, including the opium poppy, remains debated. What is clear from the text is that Odysseus recognized the threat. Men who had forgotten home were no longer truly themselves. The Cave of the Cyclops, Pride and its Price. The encounter with Polyphemus. The Cyclops represents one of the most detailed and famous episodes in the Odyssey. After leaving the Lotus Eaters, the fleet came upon a fertile island with good anchorage. Odysseus observed a larger island nearby where inhabitants lived, evidenced by smoke from fires and the sound of livestock. Homer makes clear that Odysseus made a conscious choice to investigate, taking 12 men and a skin of extraordinarily strong wine gifted by Merong, a Ciconian priest whose life Odysseus had spared. The wine was so potent that it was normally mixed with 20 parts water to 1 part wine. This detail becomes crucial later. They found a cave filled with cheeses, milk, and pens of animals, clearly the prosperous dwelling of a herdsman. Homer explicitly states that Odysseus's men urged him to take provisions and leave immediately, but Odysseus refused, wanting to meet the owner and receive proper guest gifts. This decision, born of curiosity and perhaps vanity, would prove catastrophic. The cave's owner was Polyphemus, one of the Cyclopes. Homer describes the Cyclopes as a lawless race of giants who lived without agriculture or councils, each one independent and caring nothing for Zeus or the other gods. When Polyphemus returned and sealed the cave with an enormous boulder, Odysseus and his men were trapped. Homer's account is graphic. Polyphemus grabbed 2 men, smashed their heads against the cave floor, and ate them raw, brain and bone and blood and flesh, leaving nothing. Over the next days, he would consume 6 more men, 2 at a time. The escape plan that Odysseus devised demonstrates the cunning intelligence, métis, for which he was famous. He offered Polyphemus the undiluted wine, which had never been tasted by the Cyclops before. When asked his name, Odysseus replied, "Nobody." Audis in Greek. When Polyphemus, drunk and pleased, promised a guest gift of eating Odysseus last, he revealed the cruelty beneath his words. After Polyphemus passed out from the strong wine, Odysseus and his men drove a sharpened, fire-hardened olive wood stake into the giant's single eye, blinding him. When neighboring Cyclopes came to investigate Polyphemus's screams, they asked who was attacking him. His response, "Nobody is killing me by trickery," caused them to assume he was suffering from divine affliction and leave. The next morning, Odysseus implemented the second phase of his plan. His men tied themselves to the undersides of Polyphemus's sheep. When the blind Cyclops released his flock to graze, he felt only the backs of the animals, never checking beneath. The escape was successful. But then Odysseus made what Homer presents as a critical error driven by pride, hubris. As the ships pulled away, Odysseus stood and shouted back, revealing his true identity. "Cyclops, if any mortal asks who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca." His men begged him to remain silent, but the damage was done. Polyphemus, now knowing his enemy's name, raised his arms and prayed to his father, Poseidon, god of the sea. The prayer, recorded in Book 9, is specific and devastating. May Odysseus never reach home, or if the fates decree he must, may he arrive late, in wretched condition, all his companions lost, in another man's ship, and may he find trouble in his halls. Poseidon heard his son's prayer. From this moment, the god of the sea would pursue Odysseus across the waters, ensuring that the journey home would take years rather than weeks, that every companion would die, that Odysseus would arrive exactly as Polyphemus had cursed. The price of that one boast, that failure of self-control, would be 10 years of wandering and 600 lives lost. The bag of winds, so close and yet so far. After the Cyclops disaster, Odysseus needed something to go right. On the floating island of Aeolia, home of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, he found temporary respite. Aeolus, according to Homer's account in Book 10, was granted special powers by Zeus to control the winds. After a month of hospitality, Aeolus gave Odysseus an extraordinary gift, a leather bag containing all the winds that might blow the fleet off course, leaving only the west wind free to carry them directly home. For 9 days, the favorable wind held. Homer specifies that Odysseus guarded the bag constantly, refusing sleep, refusing to explain fully what it contained. On the 9th day, Ithaca came into view, so close they could see fires burning on shore. Exhausted from 9 days without sleep, Odysseus finally allowed himself to rest. While he slept, his men, who had been watching him guard the mysterious bag, convinced themselves it must contain treasure. Homer records their reasoning. Gold and silver from Aeolus that Odysseus was hoarding while they received nothing. They opened the bag. The winds exploded out, driving the ships backward. Within hours, they had been swept back to Aeolia. Odysseus begged Aeolus for help again, but the keeper of the winds refused, believing Odysseus must be cursed by the gods if they granted him safe passage, and he still failed to reach home. This episode demonstrates one of the Odyssey's recurring themes: The gap between leaders and followers, the consequences of distrust, and how close success can be before disaster strikes. Some scholars interpret the bag of winds as a metaphorical device Homer used to explore themes of trust and discipline, though the poet presents it as a literal divine gift. The Laestrygonians, the worst massacre. After rowing for 6 days, Homer notes they had no favorable wind. The fleet spotted what appeared to be an ideal harbor with tall cliffs on both sides and a narrow entrance. 11 of the 12 ships entered and tied up inside. Odysseus, perhaps learning from the Cyclops' experience, kept his own ship outside near the entrance. Homer's account of what follows is brief but devastating. The scouts Odysseus sent inland encountered the Laestrygonians, a race of cannibal giants. When King Antiphates grabbed one scout to eat him, the others fled back toward the harbor. But the Laestrygonians, numbering in the thousands, took positions on the cliffs above the trapped ships and began hurling boulders down, smashing hulls and spearing survivors like fish. 11 ships with all their crews, roughly 550 men, died in that harbor. Only Odysseus's ship, anchored outside, escaped. The loss was staggering. In one afternoon, 9/10 of the expedition was destroyed. This episode, while fantastical, may reflect actual ancient fears about hostile peoples in unknown lands. Scholars have debated whether the Laestrygonians represent a historical encounter with aggressive populations or purely mythological invention. But Homer presents the account as a literal event within his narrative. Circe's island transformation and choice. When Odysseus's last remaining ship reached Aea, the men were broken. According to Homer's detailed account in books 10 to 12, they stayed on the shore for 2 days before Odysseus climbed a high rock and spotted smoke indicating habitation. He divided his crew and drew lots. Eurylochus led 22 men inland. They found a palace surrounded by wolves and mountain lions that acted tame. An ominous detail Homer includes. Inside, a woman sang as she worked at her loom. This was Circe, daughter of Helios, the sun god, and the ocean nymph Perse. She invited them inside, served them food and wine mixed with drugs, pharmaca, then struck them with her wand. They transformed into pigs, though Homer specifies their minds remained human. Eurylochus, who had stayed outside, fled back to tell Odysseus. As Odysseus went to confront Circe, he encountered Hermes, who gave him a protective herb called moly, described as having black roots and a milk-white flower, and strategic advice. When Circe's magic fails, draw your sword as if to kill her, make her swear by the river Styx not to harm you, then accept her offer to sleep with you. Homer's narrative presents these events straightforwardly, though modern scholars debate the symbolic meanings. The moly plant has never been definitively identified. Various candidates from snowdrop to wild garlic have been proposed. What matters in Homer's text is that it works. Circe's magic fails on Odysseus. She recognizes him immediately. You must be Odysseus. And after swearing the oath, she restores his men and offers genuine hospitality. What should have been a brief stay became a year. Homer simply states this fact without much explanation. Though he notes the men finally reminded Odysseus it was time to leave. Circe agreed, but gave him devastating news. Before he could reach home, he must journey to the land of the dead and consult the shade of Tiresias, the blind prophet. The historical Circe remains mysterious. Some scholars suggest she represents the archetypal dangerous woman who challenges male heroic journeys. Others interpret her as a more complex figure who tests Odysseus and ultimately helps him. Homer's text supports both readings while remaining ambiguous about her motivations. The land of the dead, prophecies and shadows. Circe's instructions for reaching the underworld were specific. Sail to where 2 rivers flow into Acheron, dig a trench, pour libations, and sacrifice sheep. The dead would come for the blood, which temporarily restored their strength and voice. Homer's account in Book 11, often called the Nequia, consultation with the dead, provides some of the Odyssey's most moving passages. The first shade to appear was Elpenor, one of Odysseus's crew who had died that very morning by falling from Circe's roof. His shade arrived before them, unburied, begging for proper funeral rites. Then came Tiresias, who delivered the crucial prophecy. Odysseus would eventually reach home, but Poseidon's anger would make the journey terrible. All his companions would die. He would arrive late, alone, in another man's ship, finding trouble in his house. But if they could restrain themselves from eating the sacred cattle of Helios on the island of Thrinacia, some might survive. If they ate the cattle, only Odysseus would live. Then Odysseus's mother Anticlea appeared. Homer's text reveals she had died of grief during his absence, unable to bear not knowing whether he lived. She told him of conditions in Ithaca. Penelope remained faithful, but was harassed by suitors. Telemachus was growing up trying to manage the estate, and Laertes had withdrawn to his farm in sorrow. Other famous shades appeared. Agamemnon, murdered by his wife upon his return from Troy, warned Odysseus not to trust too openly. Even a faithful wife, Ajax, still angry about losing Achilles' armor to Odysseus, refused to speak even in death. Achilles himself declared that he would rather be a living servant than a king among the dead. One of Homer's most powerful statements about the Greek view of death's diminishment. Scholars note that Book 11 serves multiple narrative functions. It provides prophecy driving the plot forward. It offers moral lessons through the examples of the dead, and it allows Homer to connect his epic to the broader Greek mythological tradition. The historicity of such underworld journeys in actual Greek religious practice remains debated, though consulting oracles and performing rituals for the dead were common. The Siren's Song and the Strait of Death. After returning briefly to Aea to bury Elpenor, Circe gave Odysseus detailed warnings about the dangers ahead. First would come the sirens, creatures whose song lured sailors to their deaths. Homer describes their island as littered with bones, but provides few physical details about the sirens themselves. Later, artists would depict them as bird women or mermaids, though Homer focuses solely on their voices. Following Circe's instructions, Odysseus sealed his men's ears with beeswax, but had himself bound to the mast so he could hear the song while being unable to respond to it. Homer records the sirens' words, which promise knowledge, specifically knowledge of everything that happened at Troy and everything that occurs on Earth. This suggests the sirens' power lay not just in beautiful music, but in the promise of omniscience, of finally understanding everything one yearned to know. Odysseus strained against the ropes, begging his men to release him, but they, unable to hear his pleas, bound him tighter. The ship passed safely, and Odysseus became perhaps the only person to hear the sirens and survive. Though, as Homer notes, he learned nothing from their song except its seductive power. Next came the choice between Scylla and Charybdis. Homer describes Charybdis as a whirlpool that 3 times daily swallowed the sea and spewed it forth, powerful enough to destroy any ship. Scylla was a 6-headed monster dwelling in a cave high on the opposite cliff, each head capable of snatching 1 man. Circe had told Odysseus which passage to choose, though it was an impossible decision. Charybdis would destroy the entire ship and crew. Scylla would take exactly 6 men, but leave the ship intact. Odysseus chose Scylla, but did not tell his men about her, focusing their attention instead on the obvious danger of Charybdis. As they rowed past, staying far from the whirlpool, Scylla struck. 6 men, 1 per head, were snatched from the deck. Homer calls it the most pitiful sight Odysseus witnessed in all his wanderings. His men calling his name, arms reaching back toward the ship as they were lifted into the air. Scholars interpret these sequential trials, the sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis, as representing different types of unavoidable dangers in life. Temptations that promise wisdom, losses that cannot be prevented, and the necessity of choosing between terrible options. Whether Homer intended such symbolic readings or was recording mythological geography remains debated. The cattle of the sun, the final betrayal. The island of Thrinacia, sacred to Helios, represented the final test. Homer's account in Book 12 makes clear that both Tiresias and Circe had warned Odysseus about these cattle. 7 herds of cattle and 7 flocks of sheep, each numbering 50. Animals that never died or gave birth, but remained eternally constant. Odysseus desperately wanted to sail past without landing, but his exhausted men begged for rest. He made them swear an oath not to touch the sacred herds. They swore sincerely, meaning their promise in that moment. Then the wind shifted to blow directly against their intended course, trapping them on the island. Homer states they were stranded for a full month while their provisions ran out. They tried fishing and hunting birds, but the catches were meager. Hunger weakened them daily, while the sacred cattle grazed nearby, fat and abundant. While Odysseus was inland praying and the gods sent him an unnatural sleep, Eurylochus convinced the starving men to slaughter the best cattle. His reasoning, recorded by Homer, was pragmatic. All forms of death are hateful to mortals, but the most wretched way to die is by starvation. Let us sacrifice the best cattle to the gods. If we reach Ithaca, we will build a rich temple to Helios. But if he is angry and wants to destroy our ship, I would rather die quickly in the waves than waste away here. For 6 days, they feasted while Odysseus slept. Strange omens appeared. The cattle hides crawled across the ground. The meat moaned on the spits. Lampetie, one of Helios's nymphs, reported the slaughter to her father, who demanded vengeance from Zeus. Punish the thieves, or he would take his light to the underworld instead of shining on the living. When they finally sailed, Zeus sent the promised storm. His lightning bolt struck the ship directly, killing every man except Odysseus, who clung to wreckage. The mast and keel lashed together. For 9 days he drifted, finally washing ashore on Ogygia, Calypso's island. This episode demonstrates one of the Odyssey's harshest themes: that collective punishment follows collective crime, that discipline matters, and that divine laws carry terrible consequences. When broken scholars note that while the men's hunger was genuine, their oath-breaking doomed them according to the values of Homer's world. Calypso's prison and the gods' decision. Homer's account is stark. Odysseus remained on Ogygia for 7 years. Calypso, a nymph in some traditions, a minor goddess, and daughter of Atlas, fell in love with the shipwrecked sailor and offered him immortality if he would stay forever as her consort. Each day, Homer tells us, Odysseus sat on the shore and wept, breaking his heart in tears, groaning and grief-stricken as he gazed across the barren sea. Each night he slept beside Calypso, against his will. Though Homer's Greek is ambiguous about consent, the situation continued for 7 years, longer than the Trojan War itself. Finally, in the 12th year since Odysseus left Troy, and the 20th since he left Ithaca, Athena petitioned Zeus for his release. Zeus agreed and sent Hermes with orders for Calypso to let Odysseus go. She protested the double standard. Male gods took mortal lovers freely, while goddesses were censured for the same. But Zeus's command was absolute. Calypso offered Odysseus immortality one final time. His response, recorded in Book 5, was diplomatic but firm. He acknowledged that Penelope could not compare to an immortal goddess, but even so, what I want and all my days I pine for is to go back to my house and see my day of homecoming. For 4 days, Odysseus built a raft. On the 5th, provisioned by Calypso, he sailed. For 17 days, he made good progress. On the 18th, Poseidon saw him. The god sent a storm that shattered the raft. Odysseus might have drowned, but the sea nymph Leucothea appeared in bird form and gave him her veil, a divine garment that would keep him afloat. He swam for 2 days and 2 nights before reaching the coast of Scheria, homeland of the Phaeacians. Scholars debate whether the 7 years with Calypso represent actual time or symbolic duration, a complete cycle of suffering before release. What is clear from Homer's text is that this period tested Odysseus's identity and purpose more than any physical trial. He could have chosen immortal comfort, but insisted on remaining mortal and completing his return home. Among the Phaeacians, the tale told at last. When Odysseus woke on Scheria's shore, he encountered Princess Nausicaa, who had come to wash clothes at Athena's divine prompting. Homer's account in books 6 to 8 shows Odysseus at his diplomatic best. Though naked and wild-looking, he spoke with such courtesy and grace that Nausicaa recognized his nobility and directed him to her parents' palace. King Alcinous and Queen Arete welcomed the stranger, whose name they did not yet know, and promised him passage home. During a feast, the blind bard Demodocus sang of the Trojan War, specifically of a quarrel between Odysseus and Achilles. Hearing his own name in song, Odysseus wept, pulling his cloak over his head. Alcinous, noticing his guest's distress, stopped the bard and asked directly, "Who are you?" What is your name? What is your city? And why do you weep when you hear songs of Troy?" Odysseus revealed his identity and told his entire story, everything recounted here, from the Cicones to Calypso. Homer structures the Odyssey so that books 9 to 12 are Odysseus's first-person narrative to the Phaeacians, while the rest is told in Homer's third-person voice. This technique allows readers to experience the journey both as immediate action and as retrospective storytelling. The Phaeacians, famous for their ships and seamanship, loaded one of their finest vessels with treasure and transported Odysseus to Ithaca in a single night, a voyage that would take ordinary ships weeks. They placed the sleeping Odysseus on his native shore under an olive tree, along with all the gifts they had given him. Homer records that Poseidon, seeing the Phaeacians had successfully delivered Odysseus despite his curse, turned their ship to stone as it returned to port, a final act of divine displeasure that caused the Phaeacians to swear off helping shipwrecked sailors in future. The return. A beggar in his own house. When Odysseus woke, Athena had disguised the landscape so he would not immediately recognize Ithaca. She wanted to warn him first. His house, she explained, was full of suitors courting Penelope, consuming his wealth, and plotting to kill Telemachus. If he revealed himself openly, they would kill him. Athena disguised Odysseus as an old beggar. In this form, he went first to the hut of Eumaeus, his loyal swineherd, who welcomed him with genuine hospitality. Homer's portrayal of Eumaeus is touching. Despite his lowly position, he speaks with dignity, grieves sincerely for his lost master, and treats the beggar with the respect due to any guest. While Odysseus was with Eumaeus, Telemachus returned from seeking news of his father. Athena arranged for father and son to meet alone in the swineherd's hut. When she temporarily removed Odysseus's disguise, he revealed himself to Telemachus. Now 20 years old, a young man Odysseus had last seen as an infant. Homer's account of their reunion is emotional but brief. They had little time for sentiment. They needed to plan how to reclaim the palace from more than 100 armed suitors. Odysseus's strategy was characteristically cunning. Keep his return secret, enter the palace as a beggar, test the suitors, and when the moment came, strike with surprise as their advantage. The next day, disguised again, Odysseus entered his own palace for the first time in 20 years. The suitors mocked him, threw food at him. One even hurled a footstool at his head. He endured their abuse, observing, noting who was irredeemably cruel and who showed some restraint. His old dog Argos, lying on a dung heap, recognized his master despite the disguise. Homer's description is heartbreaking. The dog wagged his tail once in greeting, then died, having lived just long enough to see Odysseus return. That evening, Penelope, told by Telemachus that a beggar had news of Odysseus, summoned the stranger. She did not recognize her husband. She ordered Euryclea, Odysseus's old nurse, to wash the beggar's feet. This nearly exposed everything. Euryclea recognized a distinctive scar on his leg from a boar hunt in his youth. She gasped, started to cry out, but Odysseus grabbed her throat and whispered urgently for silence. The nurse, weeping with joy, promised to keep his secret. These scenes demonstrate one of the Odyssey's central themes: the difficulty of recognition after long absence, the tests required to prove identity, and the question of whether anyone can truly return to who they were after 20 years and profound suffering. The contest of the bow, recognition and slaughter. On the next day, Homer specifies it is the 20th year since Odysseus left for Troy. Penelope announced a contest. She would marry whichever man could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads lined up in a row, a feat only Odysseus had ever accomplished. One by one, the suitors tried and failed. The bow was too rigid, too powerful, requiring technique they did not possess. Some heated it with fire, greased it with tallow, tried every trick they knew, none could string it. The beggar asked if he might try. The suitors mocked him, but Penelope allowed it. Odysseus examined his own bow like a musician examining a beloved instrument, then strung it effortlessly, a task that had defeated more than 100 strong young men. He knocked an arrow and shot it through all 12 axe heads perfectly. Then Athena removed the disguise. The suitors found themselves facing not a beggar, but Odysseus, king of Ithaca, holding his bow with another arrow already knocked. "Your playing time is finished," he said. Then he shot Antinous, the most arrogant suitor, through the throat. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. Homer's account in Books 22 is graphic and unsparing. The suitors, unarmed, Telemachus had removed weapons the previous night, tried to plead for mercy, offering compensation, claiming they had been misled. Odysseus granted mercy to only 2, a bard and herald forced to serve against their will. More than 100 men died in the hall where they had feasted. Afterward, Odysseus identified the disloyal servant women who had slept with the suitors and betrayed his household. They were forced to clean the blood and corpses, then hanged. It was brutal. Total justice by the standards of Homer's world. The restoration of order through elimination of those who had violated the sacred laws of hospitality and loyalty. The final test proving identity. Even after the slaughter, Penelope remained skeptical. She had heard false reports before, had been disappointed by hope too many times. When she saw him, she recognized his face. But recognition is not certainty. She tested him with what scholars call the bed trick. She casually ordered Euryclea to move Odysseus's bed outside the bedchamber. It was a trap. The bed had been built by Odysseus himself around a living olive tree, using the tree as one bedpost, making the bed immovable unless someone cut through the trunk. Odysseus reacted with immediate outrage. "Who has moved my bed? That would be impossible unless someone cut through the olive tree." With those words, Penelope knew beyond doubt this was truly Odysseus. Only the 2 of them shared that secret. No imposter could have that specific knowledge. Homer describes their reunion simply but movingly. They embraced, wept, held each other. That night they lay in their immovable bed and talked, recounting 20 years of experiences. Homer notes that Athena lengthened the night so they would have time to tell each other everything. It is a rare moment of divine kindness in a story full of divine cruelty. The Odyssey ends quickly after this reunion. The families of the slain suitors sought vengeance, but Athena intervened directly, commanding peace and declaring, Odysseus's reign restored. Homer seems to recognize that the emotional climax had already occurred. Everything after the recognition scene is merely practical resolution. What the journey cost? The hidden truth. Homer's audience knew something from the very beginning that modern readers might miss. Odysseus's journey home didn't have to take 10 years. Consider the facts carefully. The wind bag from Aeolus would have brought him home in 9 days if his men hadn't opened it. Even after that disaster, if he had simply sailed past Thrinacia without landing, or if his men had honored their oath about the sacred cattle, he would have reached Ithaca years earlier. The stops at the Cyclops cave, at Circe's island for a full year, on Calypso's island for 7 years. Many of these delays resulted from choices Odysseus made or failed to prevent. This raises an uncomfortable question that Homer leaves implicit but undeniable. How much of Odysseus's suffering was necessary, and how much was the consequence of his own decisions? His curiosity about the Cyclops cost 8 men's lives and earned Poseidon's curse. His pride in shouting his name to Polyphemus guaranteed that curse would be terrible and specific. His inability to keep his men from opening the windbag, whether through his own exhaustion or their distrust, cost them a chance at an easy homecoming. His year with Circe was comfortable but unnecessary. His men had to remind him it was time to leave. Even the final disaster with Helios's cattle stemmed partly from his decision to land on Thrinacia despite knowing the danger. This reading doesn't diminish Odysseus's heroism. It complicates it in ways that make the story more human and more true. Real journeys rarely fail purely because of fate or pure malice. They fail because of exhaustion, poor judgment, pride, curiosity, and the accumulated weight of decisions that seemed minor at the time, but proved catastrophic in retrospect. Tiresias told Odysseus that all his companions would die. But was this prophecy? A fate that could not be changed? Or was it foreknowledge of how Odysseus's choices and his men's weaknesses would inevitably play out? Homer, characteristically, offers no clear answer. What is certain is the price. 600 men left Troy with Odysseus. Not one returned to Ithaca with him. Every ship was lost, every companion died, some eaten by monsters, some drowned in storms, many killed by Zeus's lightning as punishment for their oath-breaking. Odysseus alone survived. And when he finally reached home after 20 years, what did he find? A wife who had remained miraculously faithful, but whom he did not immediately trust. A son who was a stranger to him, whom he had never known, who had grown up fatherless. A father so grief-stricken that he had withdrawn from society, a mother dead from sorrow at his absence. A kingdom bankrupted by the suitor's consumption of his wealth, and the need to kill more than 100 men in his own hall to restore order. The reunion with Penelope, beautiful and moving as Homer makes it, came at the end of 20 years of mutual suffering. She had endured decades of loneliness, harassment, and pressure to give up hope. He had lost everything and everyone except his life and his identity. They had both remained faithful, both passed their tests, but the cost was nearly everything they had. This is what Homer understood about Nostos, about homecoming. That returning is possible but never simple, that the journey changes you in ways that cannot be unchanged, that the home you return to has also changed. And that reunion requires both parties to prove they are still who they were, despite everything that tried to destroy that identity. Odysseus's Odyssey, the word we still use for any long, difficult journey, teaches us that coming home is harder than leaving, that maintaining identity through trauma is perhaps the greatest challenge humans face, that love and loyalty must be tested before they can be trusted, and that even when you finally arrive, even when you finally hold the people you love, the shadows of everything you lost, everyone who died, every choice that seemed small but proved disastrous, remain with you forever. This is why the story has survived nearly 3,000 years. Not because it promises happy endings, but because it tells the truth. That worthwhile journeys cost more than we expect, take longer than we plan, and demand more than we wanted to give. And that sometimes, if we are fortunate and clever and stubborn enough, if we refuse to forget who we are or where we belong no matter what tries to make us forget, we might, just possibly, make it home. The wine-dark sea stretches before us all. The distance seems impossible. The obstacles seem insurmountable. But the voyage continues, the story goes on, and somewhere ahead, home waits. Not unchanged, not perfect, but still recognizably home. Still the place where we belong, where someone has been waiting, where our story can finally end in recognition rather than loss. Rest now in that knowledge. And when you wake, remember, you too are Odysseus, sailing toward Ithaca, facing your own monsters and temptations, trying to find your way home. The journey is long, but it can be completed. The price is high, but it can be paid. And home, however distant, is waiting. Thank you for joining us on Odysseus's 10-year journey home. If you enjoyed this exploration of ancient myth, please subscribe to Sleepable Mythology and let us know in the comments which legendary voyage you'd like us to explore next. Rest well, knowing that even the longest journeys can end in homecoming, and that the stories of those who came before us light our own paths home. Good night.